So I don't know if you knew this, but the Democrats didn't do so well in the 2024 election. I have some stats. There are a bunch of services that try to tell you how bad the Democrats did. And there's Catalyst, there's Pew, there's the AP. So when people combine all the stats, we see a decline in the voting of certain demographics, such as women went from Democrat to Republican. Democrats lost 4.3% of women, and they lost 6.3% of urban voters, and they lost 8.7% of black women, and they lost 14% of black people overall, and they lost 21% of black men and 19% of Hispanic men, and 18, every demographic except they made little tiny gains with white women. This is not good. Well, if you're a Democrat, or maybe if you're a Hispanic man who wants his fellow Hispanic men to vote the other way. Joining me now is McKenzie Wilson. She is Director of External Affairs and Message Strategy at Blue Rose Research. McKenzie, welcome to The Gist. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So this was a trend that you all noticed. You and your boss and founder of the firm, David Shore, went on Ezra Klein talking about your own research. And there were some bold, huge numbers like Democratic support dropped by 46 points among Hispanic moderates. Is this a story of different groups all deciding to run away from the Democrats? Or is this a story of Democrats lacking appeal and it just showing up in slightly different ways with different groups?
That's a great question. I think first of all, to start, I think that people think that this is just like a 4-year trend, right? And what happened in November is really a much longer trend than just this past election cycle. For example, you mentioned losses with Latinos. If you remember from post 2016, there were all these think pieces about how Democrats were hemorrhaging support from Latino voters and how we were never going to recover. The scale of losses that we saw in 2024 was equal to that scale of losses. So we did that erosion once again, right?
We eroded and then we re-eroded to the same degree. I'm saying I will take a half step back, but you guys are Democrats who want Democrats to be elected.
Correct. We are a Democratic research firm. And so, I think that, first of all, as we look across globally, incumbents across the globe have been seeing massive losses over the last couple of years. So it's not just a uniquely Democrats in the United States problem. However, this is something we've been seeing over the last 10 to 15 years. The other thing you note was that young voters are moving away from Democrats at pretty alarming rates. It used to be just kind of you took for granted that youth voters were going to show up and vote for Democrats. Millennials were, the most liberal generation in decades. And, it looks like Gen Z is about to be the most Republican or most conservative generation in decades.
Since the Great Depression.
Yeah, it's not great for Democrats right now. Now, I will say, I think that all of this is not destiny. If you recall, during the Obama administration and during the Obama years, it used to be thought that, great as the country was changing and becoming more racially diverse, Democrats' wins for the next decades were just inevitable. There were a lot of Republicans freaking out about that at the time. And so it doesn't mean that all of this is destiny necessarily for 26 and 28. But there are some pretty clear alarm bells that we're seeing. The final thing I'll point out, Mike, is that, over the last election cycle, one of the things that we saw that was most interesting, the two trends I just talked about are kind of we've been seeing. The thing that's really changed for Democrats is these low information voters. So, low propensity voters is what we call them on the data side. And those are people
Find a nicer way to say that.
It's people that don't pay attention to politics and politely people that don't listen to this podcast, right? It's people that simply don't care or think about this stuff.
Yeah. But normal, hardworking, non-gist listeners.
Normal people. Yes. Yeah. And, it used to be if you could figure out a way to get them to the voting booth, these people who typically didn't vote, but if you got them into a voting booth, they were probably going to vote for Democrats. And essentially, that is just completely reversed. Those voters are now more Republican or more conservative. So if they are showing up, and as we've seen, Trump is galvanizing a lot of those people to show up, they're voting for Republicans. And so what that means is that kind of, this decade-long truism for Democrats, when we all vote, we win, is no longer true. And so it means that Democrats are going to have to really rethink their strategy over the next few years, particularly as we head into the midterms next November.
On that last point, I'll touch on everything you said, but on that last point about the median non-voter now being a Republican, the Democrats don't seem to realize that or want to admit it, but the Republicans don't realize this either. This shows up in every way. The Republicans are still trying to suppress votes. This doesn't seem to be a good strategy if the non-voter is a Republican. And look at Donald Trump's latest salvos against mail-in voting. Again, if you could make voting easier, and if the average non-voter, or a person who's not voting because it's not easy, is on your side, it doesn't make sense. I think what's going on is, there's a lot of things going on, but I can't tell you why the Republicans are doing this. Maybe they're slow to get religion on this. I do think it shows that the Democrats are still in denial. And if I were them, I would probably be in denial too, because reality is not so great.
Well, I think change comes slow within both, politics in general. I worked on the Hill. I mean, the Hill is stuck in the 90s. There are still fax machines in every single congressional office that are used regularly. But I think you raise a good point. And it's interesting to your point of Republicans not recognizing how the demographics of the electorate has changed, because, Trump's recent Medicaid cuts are a really great example of how that is playing out for Republicans. Entitlement cuts used to be kind of just the bread and butter of Republican policies and Republican politics. And what's really interesting is that we've noticed a correlation where, Medicaid voters tend to be a lot of those low information voters, right? Medicaid recipients tend to be people who don't pay a lot of attention to politics, but are now sort of leaning more conservative. And so, in a lot of ways, we've been seeing a little bit of media coverage about this, but, the Trump team is really hurting the people that really realistically carried him to his second presidency.
Yeah. So do you think that this will that Republican mistakes might make up for Democratic deficiencies? Because I think that there's a lot of Democratic strategy, which is to not engage with what you put out there for a number of reasons. One reason might be they don't want to endorse policies they don't want to endorse because they think they're wrong policies. Another is the people who are decision makers got into positions of power because they're advancing either through conviction or cynicism. They're advancing these policies that got them their power. It's very hard to shift course. But then they say, Trump's going to go so overboard that do we really have to do soul searching and changing either on messaging or policies? We'll just to take one example, his Medicaid cuts turn people off, and then we'll win elections that way. It's not the craziest idea in the world, is it?
I think it's a fair question, and I think you have to do both at once, right? I don't think
ideally, yeah,
definitely ideally. So first of all, I think you raise a really good point where the administration right now, I think, is making a lot of pretty strategic missteps. If I was a Republican strategist right now, Trump's tariffs are incredibly unpopular. We're starting only now to really see the effects. I think, a lot of economists are talking about kind of the 6 months out that we'll start seeing. So I think Christmas shopping will be really interesting in the next few months after that. But it is unsustainable for Democrats to not also be rethinking what issues we're prioritizing and what issues we make central to our campaigns. For example, ahead of November, one of the things we kept seeing in survey after survey is just, for the last few years, the only thing that voters across every demographic prioritizes their number one issue is the cost of living. And it's not just that it's the cost of living is number one. The second most important issue is inflation, and the third most important issue is the economy. It's really just saying
the thing that caused the cost of living to rise and the meta construction that encapsulates the cost of living. Yeah,
correct. It's just cost of living 3 times, right? Yeah, and so this was, I think, a pretty red flashing light for Democrats and Republicans. And I think that, quite frankly, regardless of ideology, regardless of partisanship, whatever party is able to adequately meet the moment right now and present policies and how they're going to, take on the cost of living crisis that, so many Americans are feeling right now is going to overperform next year and the next few years.
Yeah. So Democrats were against tariffs and they were the Trump tariffs, and Democrats were against these Medicaid cuts and they were the Trump cuts. But in those instances, Democrats are on the right side of the issue, but it's not as if they have a positive agenda per se. Then you have Zohran Mamdani, sorry to be that guy from New York City, who's trying to extrapolate this on a national level. But he is talking more about a positive agenda for affordability and cost of living. I'll also say, so is Jared Polis, but for some reason, Mamdani gets all the attention. Are there pitfalls? Are there traps when you say, my issue is going to be cost of living, but my solution is something that the electorate isn't ready for?
That's an interesting question. And I mean, look, with Zohran Mamdani, I think a rent freeze, for example, can potentially work in New York City, where it is a plus 20 Democratic liberal voting base.
You mean be
right?
popular as opposed to work.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I should be clear. Politically work. I'm not going to wade into
you don't
the
have to.
merits
I will
of-
just say almost every economist in the world will say this is one of the most tried and true terrible ideas. But go ahead.
Well, and it's well above my pay grade, I should say. I'm not a policy person. But, when it comes to on the national side, I think, looking at what we consistently see, and again, taking away how any of this is going to work, but raising the minimum wage, most people are just feeling like their paychecks are not going far enough. Taking on corporate price gouging. One of the interesting things, and one of Vice President Harris's most popular ads ahead of November 2024 was really her just talking about cracking down on corporate landlords and lowering the cost of groceries, right? I mean, these are
Sorry to interrupt. I know you're not a policy person, but this is the one that the economists, or the one or two the economists all say these are terrible ideas. Price controls are just terrible ideas.
Well, and look, I mean, I kind of think you could argue that was one of the problems from the Biden administration, right? It is very difficult to come up with policies that reasonably work on an actual practical level. When you're experiencing inflation, the not comforting thing, having worked in an administration is there aren't as many levers as you can pull as you would expect or think of, right? And so I think it's a fair question, but one that right now, to your point, Democrats seem to be reorienting ourselves around thinking about these economic policies in much more depth than we, I think, have been over the last few years.
Yeah. And I'll acknowledge, and I've said this, I think 3 times in the last week, I guess I'm so in love with my construction, but great politicians correctly diagnose the problem. Great leaders solve the problem. Those are 2 different things. So it is true. I'm going to be nitpicky and say those aren't good solutions, but really, and this is something that your firm has emphasized, if you want to change anything, you got to win. Yeah. And the way to win is, as I see it, just at least correctly diagnosing the problem in a way that resonates with Americans, which is what Trump has done and which, as all the polling shows, the Democrats haven't done.
Yeah.
One of the ways sorry, go ahead.
No, just as you were saying that, I mean, I think this is the Trump phenomenon, right? That Trump has really, one of the things that we see right now with the electorate overall is this deep resentment towards elites, right? One of the when we ask voters why they think the cost of living crisis is happening, we continually see that it's this sentiment of feeling like leaders are just out of touch with what's happening. And that, this idea that major corporations are kind of pulling one over on regular consumers. And so, again, I kind of think this gets into what you're talking about, that regardless of partisanship, regardless of policies, Zohran Mamdani and Donald Trump could not be more different in what they are proposing. But ultimately, both of them really do come back to the cost of living is too high. And I think a lot of liberals like myself have a hard time acknowledging that when it comes to Donald Trump. But what the Trump team did really brilliantly over the last year of the campaign was, really bring every issue back to inflation. And it was a big problem that Democrats couldn't meet the moment when that was occurring.
So what did Democrats do with the concern, the real concern, the acute concern, and this is a concern I share, that Trump is a burgeoning autocrat and he represents threats to democracy? Just doesn't seem, well, you tell me, you do the research. This doesn't seem to play well. This doesn't seem to actually influence voters who are open to be influenced, maybe the low information voters who only care or primarily care about cost of living. What's the advice there? Just mention it to Democrats, sit on your hand when it comes to the general election. How should Democrats tweak their messaging when what they really want to shout about is this very dangerous thing that's happening?
I mean, believe me, as a liberal who lives in Washington, D.C. right now, I completely understand that.
Well, congratulations on the newfound safety.
Thank you. Yes, it's, such a thrill being here right now. But no, I think it's a great question. Again, going back to last year, one of the things that is, again, uncomfortable as a liberal Democrat myself to grapple with is an understanding that a majority of the electorate saw Donald Trump as the extremist, saw Kamala Harris as the extremist and Donald Trump closer to themselves, right? I think that voters who are struggling right now, who, just Americans who can't afford to go to the grocery store. I recently did some polling and it's, something like 15% of Americans are, regularly at the checkout line, putting stuff back because they can't afford what's in their cart. Mm-hmm. That's a real acute pain and crisis for a lot of people. And I think where voters didn't think that we were going to be able to meet the moment, were willing to put aside a lot of personal concerns that they had over Donald Trump. And we have to understand that if we don't acknowledge that pain that voters are going through and offer solutions, to your point, we can't win elections and we can't stop what is happening. I mean, one of the things that's very difficult to acknowledge is that, Democrats don't really have any levers of power right now at all. We, have lost the House. We lost the Senate. We don't have the judiciary. We keep seeing Trump packing the courts. And so one of the other things I would point to, especially for your listeners, is that, when we ask people, this idea of protecting institutions and whatnot, what we're seeing is that an overwhelming majority of Americans are feeling distrust in the system itself, distrust in the economy. And so it is very hard, I think, to want to protect, quote unquote, protect democracy or protect institutions that you feel like are not delivering for you or you're not seeing any mileage out of.
Right. The populist moment butts up against the idea of protecting and preserving institutions and what has made the structure of the country so upsetting to most people. These are things, we could all square it in our minds, but to especially the hardworking / low information voter, when you say we have to protect the Department of Justice, they say to themselves, A, it's irrelevant, or B, where's that gotten me? What about how to talk about these things? So Third Way is circulating a memo that's probably near and dear to the Blue Rose heart, which is here's some terms that Democrats, progressives should not be using. Privilege, violences and environmental violence, dialoguing, triggering, othering, microaggression, holding space. Ooh, the cast of Wicked will have to pull back from that one. Body shaming, subverting norms, norming subversions. No, I just put that out there. Systems of oppression. It goes on and on. Overton window. It was all about Overton window. Cisgender. That's going to be a hard one. Patriarchy. Critical to much of the critique. How, I'm sure you agree with most of those. I don't know, add one or take issue with one, if you will, McKenzie. How important is that, the words, the triggering words to everything you're talking about?
Well, I'll come back to adding or subtracting. But, I think sometimes pollsters will be like, there's a magic way that you can say something to make a policy popular or something. And I really don't subscribe to that because I think you have to get the policies themselves right or understand the overall sentiment. That said, the list that you just read off, part of the problem is that fundamentally it is all postgraduate or, PhD level either idealism or just sort of messaging. And in general, right, like we can't talk about being the party of working class voters when people don't even understand what half of those words mean. I mean, you joked about the wicked thing, right? But when you watch that actual interview, they talked about it afterwards. Neither of them knew what holding space even meant. That's why they had this awkward moment, is because they both were like, they think it's supposed to be emotional, but they weren't sure. And so...
Oh, I thought it's like when you show up and you're a party of four, but one of you isn't there and you can't be seated. I didn't know anything.
I mean, so it's... I think in general, sometimes we're starting to talk to a smaller and smaller portion of ourselves and not recognizing that we have to talk to every American. And I going back to, again, I really don't want to harp on this too much, but the cost of living, right? Like how much you pay for your home, whether it's rent or a mortgage, that affects everyone, right?
Yeah.
Everyone goes to the grocery store. We have to think about the 100% issues and not issues that are, only matter to a smaller and smaller portion of the electorate.
Yeah, so some of it is Democrats shouldn't be snobs, and if you're going to connect with people, can't use words they don't understand, right? But some of it is that some of these phrases are newfangled and don't strike the listener's ear as meaningful. But some of them are policies that progressives are deeply committed to. Take food insecurity.
Sure.
You could say hunger, but it's not really the case that people are starving or malnourished as we used to think of. But it is the case, and people who are activists or are very aware of this, that, you might not know where your next meal is coming from. And when times are tough, as they were a few years ago, and maybe we'll get again, food banks get more business because of, is it malnutrition and starvation? It actually is this concept of food insecurity. So if you throw that away, which is the best phrase, aren't you kind of giving up an issue? And the other one is the LGBTQIA plus. I mean, all right, maybe you shave off the QIA plus. But you really, many Democratic activists want to talk about the LGB, or at least the LG part of it. So there is my question. We all agree, don't be snobs, don't say things people don't understand. But should you also jettison certain policy positions that might not resonate with the public, but actually you are deeply convicted about? Is that advice for Democrats?
Well, so first of all, I think even with both of those, I think sometimes we come up with catchy phrases. I mean, this is how you get into a defund the police, right? Like we have to explain what we're even talking about, right? And I think you even described food insecurity as like, you don't know where your next meal is going to come from. That's it, right? I think that resonates a lot more than food insecurity for people, because a lot more people can identify with that second one. So, and with, acronyms like LGBTQIA, first of all, I would say Congresswoman Sarah McBride did a really fantastic interview with Ezra Klein about queer issues in general, and just how, the queer movement needs to address this moment that we're in. But I think in general, we have to be coming back to these ideas or issues that matter for everyone, because a trans person also has to afford their rent every month, right? And if we're not creating an environment where every American can succeed, then we're really not doing our jobs as Democrats.
Here was another list put together by Rui Teixeira, who I know you know, and he cites your research a lot. And I don't know, you guys have probably done panel discussions together. And he talked about Democrats' handling of culturally inflected issues, contrasting it with the famous Sister Soldier moment of Bill Clinton. And he runs down the list, and he gives Democrats like a 1 out of 10 if the Sister Soldier moment was an 8 or 9 out of 10. Trans issues, a few peeps quickly slapped down by the groups and party activists. Yes, we had Seth Moulton on, that happened to him. Immigration. He says, the message is everything Trump's doing is wrong. We'll only cooperate with federal law enforcement when we feel like it. Crime, not a problem. Everything's going great, especially in D.C. I'm not going to bore my listeners with a fifth day of making this point. Race, DI is wonderful and we'll defend it to our dying death. Those who suppose the policies are racist and white supremacists. This is a variation of my last question, the importance of words. But do you think the importance of Democrats clearly separating themselves from some of these albatross issues is important? Do you think it's even possible? I mean, I know that Kamala Harris got upset and said, I've said all these things, even though you could put the albatross of what she said during the 2020 race around her neck. And Joe Biden, or at least his advisors, would just get so upset and say, we don't believe in defund the police, but it still gets pegged to them. So do you think it's even possible to do the Sister Soldier moment in 2025?
I mean, I first of all, I think it's possible. I will say, one of the things that I in a similar vein, I get a lot of questions about the they them ad that the Trump administration ran, or the Trump team ran during the 2024 election, right? Because I think it gets at sort of what you're asking. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that it's, to be clear, it's not that ad didn't have an effect, because it did. But when you look proportionally, again, like what voters care about the most, it's even less on the Republican or independent side on those cultural issues than it is the really tangible policies. And so I think what has to happen first and foremost, rather than necessarily having these nitpicky internal fights about what social issues or exactly what social positions to be taking, we have to really rethink the DNA of the way we do our communications and constantly be bringing things back to A, our best hits on Trump, which are, again, around tariffs, around these Medicaid cuts, but B, what we care about the most, which has to be cost of living. I think, again, Mondami has been doing a really good example of this, where with just about every hit, he takes it back to his most important points. Or on the, Trump, I think, is also a really great example of this communication. Every time, the administration does a tariff announcement, it doesn't go well, there's a dip in his favorability, they do a massive, ICE raid in a major city, or bring it back to immigration, which is one of his best issues, right? I always say this to Democrats, that it can feel boring sometimes as operatives or as candidates to constantly be talking about your thesis, right? Your whatever it is. And in this case, I would argue needs to be cost of living. But no one goes to see Elton John to go listen to the new stuff. They want to hear Tiny Dancer. And we have to start be creating our greatest hits so that people know and have familiarity with what we mean when we're talking about what Democrats really stand for.
Yeah. And if they sweep the country, I guess that's why they call it the blue states. I don't know. Is that somewhere in between greatest hits? Maybe greatest hits too. So what's the Democrats who don't hold power? What's their equivalent of the ICE raid or the sending in the federal troops? I
mean, one of the things that has really bothered me, or
you know what I mean by that, right? What can they actually do when they have a bad message day? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Democrats have to constantly be bringing things back to healthcare. It is what we kind of think of at my firm as it's not quite a trifecta issue, because there aren't really three, but it's an issue where Democrats have a massive trust advantage on, and it's also incredibly important to voters. And we also have this really important media opportunity because, Trump just made these massive Medicaid cuts. The other thing is, people are only thinking about this from tangible, people are going to lose their health care through Medicaid. But, we're seeing rural hospitals closing, on the verge of closing. You could be doing events at just about every hospital in the country. You could be doing walkouts of nurses. You could be doing protests in the parking lots about these massive cuts that are going to have, I worked at the Department of Health and Human Services, truly disturbing levels of impacts to our public health system, let alone that the Republicans are also on track to let Affordable Care Act tax cuts or tax credits expire at the end of the year, which means that a lot of Americans are about to see their monthly health insurance premiums go up every month next year, and they don't even know it's about to happen. And so there's a lot that we need to be doing, not just responding to what's happening in the news, but driving our own news cycles. And I think that's something Democrats really need to be thinking about and working on over the next few years.
Hey, on immigration, which you just said Trump is pretty popular on.
Yeah.
And that's what the empirical data says to me. But I see a lot of activists saying he's destroying his base and turning Americans away from him because of his excesses on some of the stuff like Abrego Garcia or CCOT. Again, I'm not seeing that in the polls. But if we're talking about Hispanic moderates and we're talking about a shift from 62 to 16, might just with that demographic, might we see some turnaround that could have an effect in midterms or 2028?
It's possible. I think, again, you alluded to this, but when we look at Trump's favorability, one of the areas where he is strongest right now is on immigration. And I think, again, that is something that as liberal Democrats, it is a tough pill to swallow. It is not something I particularly enjoy thinking about, but also, as operatives, we have to understand the electorate as it is and the country as it is and not what we want it to be. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's certainly possible. But even among a lot of Hispanic voters, you also talked about moderate Hispanics. We've also seen a lot of losses with conservative Hispanics as well. And so a lot of, Trump's immigration policies, I'm not talking about maybe the most egregious stuff, like sending, 8-year-olds to Mexico that are getting, their cancer treatments. But a lot of it is popular. And so it's hard for me to say necessarily what demographics will, how certain demographics will necessarily respond to everything. But at least right now, that's not what we're seeing.
So hearing everything that you said, here is what I would put together as a Democratic playbook for anyone running for the House in 26 or president in 28. Be likable. Don't say stupid things. Talk about the important things to Americans, which is affordability. You don't have to come up with a perfect solution, but constantly hammer the fact that Republicans and Trump have hurt affordability. That's probably the winning strategy.
That sounds great. You want to take my job? Yeah.
Okay. So last question. You're probably going to want to consult with specific people, so you don't want to alienate anyone. But can you talk about someone who's possibly will run for president in 28, or maybe just is a good Senate candidate, say in 26, who is talking about things correctly? Maybe you don't even want to cite their overall agenda, but you saw a podcast appearance that you thought worked. You heard a sentence that you thought was brilliant and fits into this. Anything like that come to mind?
That's a great question. Well, as you were talking, I think Andy Beshear has been doing a good job of kind of leading Kentucky governor. Everyone keep tabs on him.
What's he do? What do you like about how he talks or what he says or what his policies are?
Well, I think he constantly brings it back to, he's unapologetic about being a Democrat, which I think, is important. Some of this is some of our values and ideals are baked in. But I also think that he understands where the Republican electorate sort of is. Again, red state governor. He's talked about, some of the ways that Democrats need to be rethinking the way that we talk about things. For example, he had a recent appearance where he was talking about we can't be saying justice-involved individuals. We're talking about inmates. And that's okay, right? I think sometimes as Democrats or progressives, we want to be polite and also need to understand that when we, alienate the people that we are trying to reach with the very language we are using, we are not just ineffective. We're quite literally talking to a circle of ourselves. Yeah.
But it's funny, the blue Democrat in the red state, when he says that, everyone in his red state, everyone in Kentucky nods and says, oh yeah, it's such an obvious point. When Seth Moulton says it in his Salem, Massachusetts, plus 40 something Democratic district, it's the old cliche about the crabs pulling you down as you try to crawl out of the pot. He gets slaughtered. Same thing was actually said by the Long Island representative who replaced DeSantis. Do you remember who I'm trying to think of? Anyway, so when Seth Moulton says it, he gets pulled down like crabs from in the cliche. That's, I don't know what Democrats as a whole could do, but that is a phenomenon.
Well, I think we have a big tent party for a reason. And we have to understand that, not everyone is going to be singing from the exact same part of the songbooks at all hours of the day. But we, again, thinking about Seth Moulton, at the end of the day, he still voted with Democrats on, issues that mattered most. And so at the end of the day, we do have to leave space for where politicians need to tack and understand where their districts really are.
McKenzie Wilson is Director of External Affairs and Message Strategy at Blue Rose Research. Thank you very much. Good messaging. Excellent strategy, McKenzie.
Great. Thanks so much.